No hydrothermal explosion in the history of Yellowstone has ever happened this close to a monitoring station, roughly 100 meters, a little longer than a football field. That is the distance between the instruments and the spot where, on June 13th, 2026, the ground at Biscuit Basin suddenly tore open. For once, science was not staring at the wreckage the morning after. For once, the cameras and the sensors were close enough to watch it happen, and to watch what came next, which was a piece of solid ground collapsing into a pool of boiling water over the following days. The question now is whether, hidden in that data, there was a warning sign nobody has ever been able to catch before. But first, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and leave a comment with where you're tuning in from tonight. Now, let's break this down. Part 1. The morning. The ground spoke first. The instruments knew before anyone else did. It was about 9 minutes past 5 in the morning on Saturday, June 13th, 2026, and the sky over Yellowstone was still that bruised blue-black it gets just before a summer dawn. There were no tourists on the boardwalks. There was no ranger standing at the railing with a paper cup of coffee. There was only a small cluster of monitoring equipment, sitting quietly in the dark inside a place called Biscuit Basin, doing the patient, unglamorous work of listening to the ground. And in that moment, the ground said something the instruments had never been positioned to hear this clearly before. What they picked up was not heat. That part matters, so hold on to it. A thermal basin like this one is always warm, always steaming, always venting a little energy into the cold morning air, and the sensors are used to that. This was different. The instruments registered a sharp pulse of seismic energy, the kind of small jolt that travels through rock, and at the very same time they caught something stranger. They caught infrasound. Infrasound is a pressure wave that sits below the floor of human hearing, a sound too low and too slow for your ears to register, the kind of signal a volcano makes when something buried and pressurized suddenly moves. Pressure waves and volcanoes are not a combination anyone likes to see together. And this pressure pulse had a direction. It was coming from the direction of a feature called Black Diamond Pool. If you have followed this channel for a while, that name should make the back of your neck prickle. Black Diamond Pool is not an obscure little hot spring. It is one of the most volatile patches of ground in the entire park, and we will get into exactly why in a few minutes. So when the signal arrived from that direction, the first conclusion was the obvious one. The scientists assumed that Black Diamond Pool had done it again. They assumed the pool itself had blasted open, the way it had done before, throwing its contents into the sky. It was a completely reasonable assumption. It was also, as the data would soon reveal, wrong in a way that makes this whole event far more unsettling than a simple repeat performance. Here is where the story turns. When the scientists pulled the temperature record from the sensor sitting right at Black Diamond Pool, the numbers refused to cooperate with the easy explanation. If the pool had violently erupted, that sensor should have screamed. It should have shown a sudden, brutal spike in temperature, the signature of superheated water and steam tearing upward. Instead, it showed only a small, almost shy little change. A nudge, not a blast. The pool, in other words, had an alibi. Whatever had happened that morning, the known troublemaker was not the one who had thrown the punch. So if it was not the pool, then what exactly had just shoved a pressure wave through the ground at 9 minutes past 5 in the morning? The answer was sitting on a camera. In a moment that I find genuinely chilling, the camera at the site had been recording the whole time, and when the scientists scrubbed back through the footage to the right timestamp, they watched it happen. At about 50 seconds past 5:09 in the morning, a dark plume of steam suddenly jetted up out of the ground. Not from the pool, from the ground. From a patch of bare, unremarkable earth just to the north of Black Diamond Pool, a piece of ground that the day before would not have earned a second glance from anyone walking past it. That is the detail I cannot stop turning over in my head. The explosion did not come from the dangerous feature everyone was watching. It came from the quiet ground beside it. Think about what that actually means for a second. For years, the attention, the cameras, the warnings, the closed boardwalks, all of it has been pointed at the known hotspots. The pools that have blown before, the features with a track record. And on this particular morning, the Earth chose to open a brand new mouth in a place with no track record at all, in ground that looked, for all the world, completely solid. It is the difference between watching the dog you know bites and getting bitten by the patch of grass you are standing on. The threat did not announce itself by escalating at a known location. It simply appeared, fully formed, somewhere new. And this is only the opening scene. Because what the instruments caught that morning was not a single event with a clean beginning, middle, and end. It was the first move in a sequence that would keep unfolding for days, a sequence in which the ground would tear, then bleed sediment into a river for miles, then do something that genuinely has not been documented this way before. The morning of June 13th was the gunshot. What came after was the part nobody saw coming, and the part that should change how you think about every quiet, steaming acre of that park. So before we get to the thing that collapsed, we need to talk about why those instruments were sitting exactly where they were sitting, because that detail, more than almost anything else, is what makes this event one for the history books. There is something I keep coming back to about that hour, and it is the strangeness of machines being awake while the whole human world slept. No one chose that moment. No one was watching a screen and saw the numbers jump. The detection happened automatically, in the cold and the dark, the instruments faithfully writing down a pulse of energy that no human ear could have heard and no human eye could have seen, while a few miles away people were asleep in their beds and their tents. We tend to imagine discovery as a person having a moment of insight. This was the opposite. This was the Earth confessing something in the middle of the night, and only later, when people woke and looked at the record, did anyone realize a confession had been made at all. And consider the brutal arithmetic of the timing, because it is the only reason this is a science story and not a tragedy. 9 minutes past 5 in the morning, in a basin that had already been closed to the public for nearly a year, is about the safest possible moment for the ground to do something violent. Shift that same event a few hours forward, into a bright summer afternoon, and reopen the basin, and you no longer have a fascinating data set. You have people standing near a patch of ground that suddenly decided to explode. That gap between what happened and what could have happened is razor thin, and it is the gap this entire video lives inside. And it is worth saying plainly, right at the outset, what kind of story this is and is not. Because the word Yellowstone tends to send people's minds in one direction. This is not the story of the supervolcano stirring. We will get to that fear, and we will look at exactly what the data says about it, and the data is reassuring on that front. This is a story about something smaller, closer, and in a strange way more immediate than the magma chamber, something that operates not over hundreds of thousands of years, but over the span of a single morning. It is the story of the ground itself, the thin and beautiful crust we walk across, and what happens when that crust decides, without warning, that it is no longer going to hold. Keep that distinction in your mind as we go, because almost everything that makes this event important flows from it. Part 2. The closest anyone has ever been. Let me tell you why this particular explosion may end up being one of the most important things ever recorded at Yellowstone, and it has almost nothing to do with how big it was. It has to do with how close the instruments were standing when it went off. About 100 meters away. That is roughly 328 feet, a little longer than a football field. That is the distance between the monitoring station and the spot where the ground tore open on the morning of June 13th. And according to the United States Geological Survey, no hydrothermal explosion in Yellowstone has ever happened that close to a monitoring station. Not once. Not in all the years scientists have been studying this place. This was the closest seat anyone has ever had to the show, and the show is one that almost never lets you sit close. To understand why that is such a big deal, you have to understand how blind science has historically been to these events. Hydrothermal explosions are sudden, they are violent, and they are extremely local, and most of the time they happen in the middle of nowhere, with not a single sensor pointed at them. By the time anyone arrives, the explosion is long over, and all that is left is the wreckage. It is like trying to study lightning by only ever looking at the scorch mark on the tree the next morning. You can learn something from the aftermath. You cannot learn the thing you most want to know, which is what happened in the seconds and minutes right before. What was the warning, if there even was one? Now, that gap in knowledge is exactly why the equipment was there in the first place. In the summer of 2025, scientists installed a new monitoring station at Biscuit Basin. The year before that, in May of 2025, they had also installed a camera trained on the area around Black Diamond Pool. This was not random. This was a deliberate decision to wire up one of the twitchiest, most dangerous patches of ground in the park, precisely because they suspected it had more to say. They planted their ears and their eyes in the basin, and then they waited. And on June 13th, 2026, the ground performed barely a football field away from the very instruments built to catch it in the act. If you wanted to design the perfect natural experiment, you could not have placed it better, and no scientist would ever have dared to hope the timing would line up this neatly. So what did that closeness buy them? It bought them data of a kind that has essentially never existed before. They have the seismic record, the small jolt travelling through the rock. They have the infrasound, that low-pressure moan beneath hearing. They have the temperature trace from the pool, and they have the camera footage, the actual visual moment of the plume bursting from the ground. 4 different windows onto the same instant, all captured from close range, all time-stamped, all able to be lined up against one another second by second. That is not a scorch mark on a tree. That is the lightning bolt itself, photographed and measured from 100 meters away. And here is the question that all of that data exists to answer, the question that every scientist studying this is now chasing. Was there a warning? Somewhere in those traces, in the minutes before 50 seconds past 5:09 in the morning, is there a tell? A subtle creep in temperature, a flutter in the infrasound, a whisper of seismic noise that, if you knew to look for it, would have said, "Get back, it is about to go"? Because if that signal is in there, then for the first time, scientists might have a real shot at forecasting these events, at giving people minutes of warning before the ground opens. And if that signal is not in there, if the traces are flat and calm right up until the instant the Earth let go, then we are facing the more frightening truth. We are facing the possibility that this ground can stay perfectly quiet, perfectly normal, perfectly safe-looking, right up until the half second it kills you. I want you to sit with how unusual this opportunity is because it cuts both ways. This is, on one hand, a scientific gift, a once-in-a-generation dataset that researchers will be combing through for years. And it is, on the other hand, a window into a hazard that has been almost impossible to study and almost impossible to predict. The same closeness that makes the data so precious is the same closeness that, on a busy summer afternoon with the boardwalks open, would have put human beings exactly where the ground decided to tear. The instruments were lucky. They were not standing where people stand. But that luck, that timing, is the only thing that separated a historic dataset from a headline none of us would want to read. And to understand just how thin that margin really is, we have to go back almost 2 years, to the morning this same patch of ground tried to kill a crowd. It helps to understand that this monitoring station was not a one-off gadget bolted down on a hunch. It was part of a deliberate, broader plan that the scientists who watch Yellowstone had been building, a plan specifically designed to bring the shallow hydrothermal hazard out of the shadows. The idea was to install broadband seismic sensors, infrasound microphones, thermal monitors, and deformation instruments directly inside the geyser basins themselves, rather than relying on a distant regional network that, as we will see, could barely hear these events at all. In other words, the scientific community had recognized that it was effectively blind to one of Yellowstone's most immediate dangers and had started deliberately to build itself a pair of eyes. So when I say the instruments were 100 meters away, understand that this was not luck alone. It was luck layered on top of foresight. Somebody decided that this specific basin, this specific stretch of ground around this specific volatile pool, was the place most worth wiring up, and they were proven right faster than they could have reasonably hoped. The lightning did not just strike. It struck the one field where someone had finally thought to plant a lightning rod, and the rod was wired to record everything. That combination, the right hazard, the right place, the right instruments, and the right terrible timing, is what turns June 13th from a small explosion into a landmark. It is worth pausing on just how rare a gift this kind of timing is in the earth sciences, because researchers can spend entire careers waiting for an event to happen near their instruments and never see it. You can map a fault for 30 years and never feel it slip. You can wire a volcano and watch it sleep until you retire. The natural world does not perform on demand, and it certainly does not perform on cue, 100 meters from your newest sensor, less than a year after you switched it on. That this happened at all, in this spot, at this distance, in this window, is the sort of luck that scientists do not plan around because they cannot. They simply build the best instruments they can, place them where their judgment says the risk is highest, and hope. On June 13th, the hope paid off in full. Part 3. The Warning Shot of 20. 24. To understand June 13th, you have to rewind to a morning in the summer before, because what happened on the morning of June 13th was not the beginning of this story. It was a chapter in a story that opened violently on the 23rd of July, 2024, and that morning there were people standing right where the ground let go. It was just before 10 o'clock in the morning, peak season, blue sky, the boardwalk through Biscuit Basin crowded with visitors doing exactly what you do at Yellowstone. They were walking, pointing, taking photos of the steaming pools, standing at the railing a few short steps from Black Diamond Pool. And then, with no meaningful warning at all, the pool detonated. I do not use that word lightly, but there is no softer way to describe it. In an instant, Black Diamond Pool hurled a column of water, mud and rock into the sky. The plume reached somewhere between 400 and 600 feet high. Let that scale land for a second. That is taller than a 50-story building made of boiling water and flying rock, erupting out of the ground a few steps from where families were standing. Debris rained down across an area roughly 1 square kilometre in size. The wooden boardwalk, the very structure people had been standing on moments before, was battered and heavily damaged. And on the videos, which I am sure many of you have seen, you can watch people turn and run for their lives as the dark mass climbs into the air behind them. Now here is the almost unbelievable part. Nobody died. The whole event lasted only about 55 seconds, less than a minute from the first burst to the last falling rock, and somehow, in that crowded basin, with debris scattering across 1,000 square meters, not a single person was killed. That is not because the explosion was gentle. It was not gentle. That is pure, undeserved luck, a matter of exactly where each rock happened to come down and exactly where each person happened to be standing. Yellowstone got to keep its perfect record that day on a coin flip, and the people who study this place understood that completely, which is why the response was immediate and serious. The park closed Biscuit Basin, not for a day, not for a week. They closed it for the rest of the 2024 season, and that closure has held ever since. As of this event, Biscuit Basin remains closed, locked off from the public, because the scientists looked at what that ground had done and decided it could not be trusted with human beings standing on it. And I want to be very clear about one thing, because this is the part that always gets twisted online. That 2024 explosion was not the supervolcano. It was not magma. It was not the caldera waking up. It was a purely shallow event, water flashing to steam in the plumbing just beneath the surface. We will get into exactly how that works, because the mechanism is the whole key to this story. But the headline from 2024 was simple and stark. This ground can kill a crowd in under a minute with no warning anyone could use, and the pool did not go quiet afterward either. This is the thread I really want you to follow, because it is the through line that connects 2024 straight to the morning of June 13th, 2026. After the big explosion, Black Diamond Pool kept going. It kept erupting. There was an eruption in May of 2025. There was a muddy eruption recorded in December of 2025. Smaller events, here and there, again and again, a pool that simply would not settle down. Most of these were barely witnessed by anyone, for the simple reason that the basin was closed, so there were no crowds and few eyes on the scene. The pool was throwing tantrums in an empty room, but the instruments were watching, and the pattern they recorded was not the pattern of a system calming down after a big release. It was the pattern of a system that had been knocked loose and could not find its footing again. Think about what that tells us. A pressure cooker that goes off once and then falls silent is one thing. You can tell yourself the pressure is gone, the danger has passed. But a patch of ground that explodes and then keeps erupting on and off for the better part of 2 years is telling you something else entirely. It is telling you that the plumbing underneath has been fundamentally rearranged, and that it is still actively rearranging, still searching for a new and stable configuration that it has not yet found. The 2024 explosion did not end the danger at Biscuit Basin. It seems to have opened a new and restless era for it. So when the instruments lit up on the morning of June 13th, 2026, this was not a bolt from the blue. It was the same unstable system speaking again. The only question was what it would say this time, and whether it would say something it had never said before. It would. And the first sign was a wound in the ground 61 feet long. Watch the footage from 2024, and the thing that stays with you is not the size of the plume, although it is enormous. It is the human reaction. You see people at the railing, phones out, doing the ordinary thing, and then you see the instant the ordinary becomes the unthinkable, the turn, The run, the scramble back down the boardwalk as a wall of dark water and rock climbs into the sky behind them. 55 seconds. That is how long the whole thing lasted, start to finish, less than the time it takes to read this paragraph aloud. There is no time in 55 seconds to think, to plan, to evacuate in any orderly way. There is only time to react, and reacting is mostly a matter of which direction you happen to be facing when the ground let go. And here is a detail that should sit uneasily with you, because it foreshadows everything we will say later about warnings. When scientists went back to study that 2024 explosion, they found that the regional monitoring network had barely detected it at all. An event powerful enough to demolish a boardwalk and scatter debris across a square kilometre, and the instruments that were supposed to be listening to Yellowstone almost shrugged it off. That is how quiet these explosions are to the wider network, how local and how sudden. It is the single biggest reason the close-range data from June 13th matters so much. In 2024, nobody was close enough to hear the Earth clear its throat. By 2026, finally, someone was, and the closure tells you something about institutional judgment that is easy to overlook. Yellowstone is one of the crown jewels of the national park system, and Biscuit Basin, sitting so close to Old Faithful, is prime ground. The kind of place that draws crowds simply because of where it is. Closing it costs the park something real, in access, in experience, in the sheer disappointment of visitors who came to see it. And yet it has stayed closed, season after season, because the people responsible looked at the hazard and decided no view was worth the risk. When an institution gives up something valuable for safety's sake and keeps giving it up year after year, that is a louder statement about danger than any press release. It is a closed gate that has been left closed on purpose. Part 4. 3. New mouths in the Earth. When the sun finally came up on June 13th and the scientists could actually walk the ground, what they found was not one new hole. It was 3. 3 separate sets of new vents had torn open in the earth to the north of Black Diamond Pool, 3 fresh wounds in ground that the day before had been whole. A vent, if the word is new to you, is simply an opening, a weak spot where superheated water and steam from below have found a path up to the surface. So picture 3 brand new doorways punched through the crust of the basin, 3 places where the inside of the earth had suddenly connected itself to the open air. And of the 3, one in particular stopped the geologists cold. The northernmost vent group was the dramatic one, the one farthest from Black Diamond Pool, and it was still actively venting water when the team arrived. Running through it was a crack in the ground, and this is where the numbers start to get personal. The fracture ran in a north-northwest line, and it measured about 18.5 meters long. That is roughly 61 feet. 61 feet of fresh crack torn through the earth, and in places it gaped open as wide as 1.5 meters, which is about 5 feet across. 5 feet wide. I want you to actually picture standing at the edge of that. A crack in the ground long enough to swallow a school bus end to end, wide enough in spots that you could fall straight into it without touching the sides, and it was not empty. It was venting water, and that water carried a temperature. The water measured around 90 degrees Celsius. For those of us who think in Fahrenheit, that is about 194 degrees. I need you to understand what that number means at Yellowstone's elevation. Up there, where the air is thin, water boils at a lower temperature than it does at sea level, which means 90 degrees Celsius is not just hot, it is essentially right at the boiling point. This is water that is at or near a rolling boil, jetting up through a 5-foot-wide crack that did not exist the day before. So when I joke darkly that a crack like that does not just swallow you, it cooks you on the way down, I'm not exaggerating for effect. That is the literal physical reality of what opened up in the ground that morning. A boiling fissure, 61 feet long, in a spot nobody had flagged as dangerous. Now, the scientists are careful people, and they read the scene like detectives, and one detail told them this particular blast had been smaller than the monster of 2024, the rocks. When ground explodes, it throws material outward, and the distance that material travels tells you how much energy was behind it. In 2024, debris had scattered across a square kilometre. This time, the rocks thrown out by the explosion had only travelled a few metres, a few feet really, from the vents. That is the fingerprint of a smaller event, and on the surface that sounds reassuring. Smaller explosion, less energy, less danger, right? And here is where I have to stop you, because this is the trap at the centre of this entire story. Smaller does not mean safer. In fact, what this smaller event went on to do was, in one specific and important way, more disturbing than the larger one. Because the 2024 blast exploded and then it was over. This one exploded and then it kept changing. But before we get to the part that kept changing, stay with these 3 vents for a moment, because they are already telling us something important about how this hazard behaves. The explosion did not reopen the old wound. It cut 3 new ones, in fresh ground, in a line marching away from the known pool. That is not a feature settling back into a familiar groove. That is a system breaking new ground, literally, finding new paths to the surface, expanding the footprint of where the danger lives. Every one of those vents is a place where, from now on, the crust is weaker, where the boundary between you and the boiling plumbing below is thinner than it looks. And the basin had already shown, in 2024, that it does not send a clear invoice before it collects. So the map of dangerous ground at Biscuit Basin did not just get more active on June 13th, it got bigger. New mouths, in new places, with no promise that the next one will not open somewhere new again. And then the scientists looked downstream, toward the river, and they saw the second piece of evidence, the one that proved this was never just a puff of steam. The river had changed colour. Something underground had emptied itself out, and the proof of it was now flowing for miles through the heart of the park, turning one of Yellowstone's famous rivers a strange and milky grey. To understand what that grey water was actually telling them, we have to follow it downstream. To picture a vent properly, it helps to know what the ground around these features is actually made of, because it is not ordinary soil. Over centuries, the silica-rich water has coated the surface in a pale, crusty mineral deposit, a kind of natural cement that forms a deceptively solid-looking shell over the hot, wet, churning system beneath. So when a new vent opens, it is not punching through dirt. It is breaking through that brittle mineral crust, the lid of the pressure cooker, and what lies immediately below is not more solid ground. It is the plumbing. That is why a fresh vent is so significant. Each one is a place where the lid has cracked and the inside has reached the surface, and the fact that 3 of them opened in a line, marching north away from the known pool, is its own quiet warning. It suggests the disturbance was not confined to a single point, but propagated along a path, following whatever weakness runs beneath that ground. The Earth did not just poke one new hole, it traced a seam, and a seam means the next failure could occur anywhere along that line, or at the end of it, in ground that today looks every bit as solid and harmless as the spot that tore open on the morning of June 13th. The map of danger did not just gain 3 dots, it gained a direction. And there is a reason the temperature of that water, around 90 degrees Celsius, deserves a second look. Because at Yellowstone's elevation, it sits right at the edge of boiling. Water does not boil at the same temperature everywhere. Up in the high country, where the air presses down with less weight, the boiling point drops, which means water that would still be merely scalding at sea level is, up there, already at a rolling boil. So the water jetting from that 61-foot fracture was not just hot in the way a kettle is hot. It was at the threshold where liquid is constantly trying to tear itself into steam, the most energetic state water can hold before it stops being water at all. That is the fluid that had found its way to the surface through ground that, the day before, had looked like nothing at all. Part 5. The river that turned to milk. The Firehole. River runs through this part of Yellowstone, and on June 13th it carried the secret of what had happened underground for miles in plain sight. Downstream of Biscuit Basin, the water turned a strange, light, milky grey. Not muddy the way a river gets after a rainstorm when runoff washes soil off the land and into the current. This was different. This was the river itself going pale from the inside, loaded with fine sediment that had not come from the surface at all. It had come from below. And that colour, that pale grey plume sliding downstream, is one of the most important clues in the entire event, because it proves that what happened on the morning of June 13th was never just steam. Here is why that distinction matters so much. If you only had the camera footage, you might tell yourself a comforting story. You might say, well, it was a burst of steam from a hot spring, dramatic to watch, but really just hot air and water vapour, the kind of thing this basin does. But steam does not turn a river grey. Sediment turns a river grey. And for the river to fill with that much fine, ground-up material, something underground had to have been physically torn apart and flushed out. Water, mud, broken rock and sediment had been forced up out of the shallow plumbing system, beneath the basin, and shoved out across the surface, and from there it drained into the firehole and rode the current away. The grey was the inside of Yellowstone evacuated and put on display for anyone downstream to see, and it travelled. The discoloured water was carried roughly 6 kilometres downstream. That is about 3 7/10 miles, a real distance, the kind of stretch that takes you well out of the immediate basin and toward another famous thermal area, the Midway Geyser Basin. So this was not a little grey smudge right at the vents. This was a plume of evacuated subsurface material long enough and concentrated enough to colour a river for miles, stand at a railing several miles from where the ground tore open, on a morning when you might not have heard a thing about any explosion, and you would still have seen the evidence drifting past your feet, pale and silent and strange. I find something genuinely haunting about that image, and I want to tell you why. A hydrothermal explosion is, by nature, a hidden thing. It happens fast, it happens in one spot, and unless you are standing right there, you miss it. But the river does not miss it. The river is downstream of everything, patiently carrying whatever the ground decides to give it, and on that morning it became a kind of messenger, broadcasting the news of a violent subsurface event for miles in every direction the current flowed. The ground spoke first in pressure waves the instruments caught, then it spoke again, in grey water, to anyone with eyes. Two completely different languages, both saying the same thing. Something down there just let go. So now, let us assemble what we actually know happened in those first hours. A pressure pulse and a seismic jolt at 5:09 in the morning. A dark plume bursting from bare ground 50 seconds later, caught on camera. 3 new vents torn open to the north of the known pool. A boiling fracture 61 feet long. And a river running grey for nearly 4 miles with material flushed out of the Earth's shallow plumbing. That is already a remarkable sequence, and if it had stopped right there, it would still be a story worth telling. But it did not stop there. The most unusual part, the part that genuinely sets this event apart from the explosion of 2024, had not even happened yet. To understand why what came next is so unsettling, though, you first need to understand exactly what kind of machine is buried under that ground. You need to understand how a piece of the earth turns itself into a bomb. There is a grim irony in the name of the river that carried the evidence away, because it is called the Firehole, a name given long ago by people who sensed that this was a stretch of water threaded through ground that burned. On June 13th, the Firehole earned its name again, running pale with the ground-up insides of the basin. And the direction it carried that grey plume matters too, because downstream lies the Midway Geyser Basin, home to some of the most photographed thermal ground on Earth. So the evidence of the explosion did not drain off into some forgotten corner. It flowed straight through the beating centre of the park's thermal country, past features that millions of people travel across the world to see. Scientists actually treat this kind of river discoloration as a recognised signal, not just a curiosity. A sudden surge of fine sediment and turbid water into a thermal-fed river is a fingerprint of subsurface disturbance, a way of reading what the ground did without having to witness the explosion directly. In a sense, the river is a recorder of its own. It cannot tell you the exact moment or the precise mechanism, but it can tell you, unmistakably, that something tore loose underground and emptied itself toward the surface. On June 13th, that recorder ran grey for nearly 4 miles, and anyone who knew how to read it would have understood instantly that this had been no ordinary morning in the basin. And the grey water carries one more piece of information that is easy to miss, which is what it says about volume. To discolour a river for nearly 4 miles, you do not need a teaspoon of sediment. You need a substantial quantity of material, forced out of the ground and into the current in a short span of time. So the river is not just telling us that something happened. It is telling us, roughly, that a lot of something happened, that the explosion and the venting moved a real mass of water, mud, and ground-up rock out of the shallow system and onto the surface. The basin did not merely hiccup, it emptied a meaningful piece of its insides into the firehole, and the river dutifully carried the receipt downstream for everyone to read. Part 6. The Pressure Cooker Beneath Your Feet. So how does solid, quiet-looking ground turn into something that explodes without warning? The answer is one of those pieces of science that, once you understand it, you cannot unsee, and it will change the way you look at every steaming pool in every photograph of Yellowstone you ever see again. It comes down to one humble ingredient and one simple, brutal piece of physics. The ingredient is silica, The physics is a pressure cooker, and together they turn the gentle plumbing of a hot spring into a sealed bomb with a timer nobody can read. Let us start with the water, because everything begins there. Beneath Yellowstone, hot water circulates through a maze of shallow underground cracks and channels, what scientists call conduits. As long as those channels stay open and connected to the surface, everything is fine. The hot water and steam can rise, vent, bubble out, release their energy gently and continuously. That is what a hot spring is. That is what a geyser is. More or less, a system that lets the pressure out in regular bursts. An open channel is a safe channel, because pressure that can escape never gets the chance to build into something dangerous. The trouble starts when the channel closes. Now here is where silica comes in, and it is sneaky. The hot water down there is loaded with dissolved silica, which is essentially dissolved rock, the same family of material as quartz and glass. As that water rises toward the surface and cools, the silica can no longer stay dissolved, so it precipitates out, meaning it comes out of the water and hardens into a solid coating on the walls of the channels. Over time, layer by patient layer, that silica builds up like mineral scale inside an old pipe. And silica is impermeable. Water cannot pass through it. So slowly, invisibly, over months or years, the silica can seal a channel shut, capping it off, turning an open vent into a closed chamber. The escape route quietly welds itself closed, and nobody on the surface sees a thing. And now you have built a pressure cooker. Picture it. You have a sealed underground chamber, full of water, sitting on top of Yellowstone's enormous reservoir of heat. The heat keeps pouring in from below, the water keeps getting hotter, but the steam can no longer escape, because the silica has capped the lid. So the pressure inside climbs, and climbs, and climbs. Exactly like the pressure cooker on a stove, where the heat keeps rising but the steam is trapped, the energy has nowhere to go but up, into ever higher pressure inside a sealed space. And the only thing holding all of that back is the strength of the rock around the chamber. The rock is the lid, and every lid has a breaking point. When the pressure finally exceeds the strength of the rock fails, it cracks, and the instant it cracks, the catastrophe happens almost faster than you can describe it. The moment that sealed, superheated, pressurized water feels the pressure drop, it does not just leak out, it flashes. In a heartbeat, an enormous volume of that water transforms from liquid into steam, and steam takes up vastly more space than liquid water does. That violent, instantaneous expansion is the explosion. It blows the broken rock outward, throws water and mud and debris into the sky, and tears open the ground. That is a hydrothermal explosion. Not magma, not lava, just water, heat, a mineral seal, and the unforgiving arithmetic of pressure versus the strength of stone. And now you understand why these events are so monstrously hard to predict, and why that monitoring station 100 meters away is worth its weight in gold. The whole deadly process, the sealing, the pressure building, the rock straining toward its breaking point happens underground, out of sight, with very little to show on the surface. The ground above a sealing chamber does not glow. It does not obviously bulge in a way you would notice on a casual walk. It can look completely, convincingly normal right up until the instant the lid lets go. That is the heart of the hazard, and it is the reason the data from June 13th is so precious. Because somewhere in those close-range traces is the answer to the only question that matters. In the minutes before the rock broke, was there any sign at all? Or does the pressure cooker truly give nothing away until it is already too late? Hold that question, because the ground at Biscuit Basin was not finished. The explosion was over in moments, but the failing had only just begun. If the pressure cooker image does not quite land for you, try a different one. Think of a sealed can of soda that has been shaken and then left in a hot car. The liquid inside is under pressure, the gas wants out, and the only thing holding it back is the thin wall of the can. Now imagine you cannot see inside and you have no idea how shaken or how hot it has gotten, and the only way you will ever find out is the instant it splits. That is the position scientists are in with sealed hydrothermal ground. The energy is building in a container they cannot see into, and the first unambiguous signal that the container has failed is the explosion itself. And the violence of that final moment comes down to a single, almost unbelievable fact of physics. When water flashes to steam, it expands enormously, on the order of 1,600 times its liquid volume, almost instantly. So the instant that sealed, superheated water feels the pressure drop as the rock cracks, It does not seep or trickle. It detonates outward as steam, expanding 1,600-fold in a heartbeat, blasting rock and mud and water into the sky. That is why these events are so sudden and so violent despite involving nothing more exotic than water and heat. It is not a chemical explosion. It is a phase change, water becoming steam, happening faster and more forcefully than almost anything else in nature, in a space that had spent months or years quietly loading itself toward exactly that release. And here is the part of the mechanism that should genuinely unsettle you, because it explains the no-warning problem at its root. Every step of this process, the silica slowly sealing the conduit, the pressure climbing inside the sealed chamber, the rock straining toward its breaking point, happens out of sight and, crucially, without necessarily changing anything you could see or feel on the surface. The ground above does not have to glow. It does not have to obviously swell in a way a passing visitor would notice. It can sit there looking exactly like solid, ordinary safe ground while, a few feet beneath, a chamber loads itself toward failure like a drawn bow. The disaster assembles itself in secret, and the surface keeps its poker face right up until the instant the rock gives. That is not a flaw in our monitoring. That is the fundamental nature of the hazard, and it is precisely why being close enough to measure the hidden part matters so much. It is also worth understanding why silica, of all things, is the villain of this particular story because it is not an exotic substance. It is one of the most common materials on Earth, the stuff of sand and quartz and glass. At Yellowstone, the superheated water dissolves silica out of the surrounding rock the way hot tea pulls flavour from leaves, carrying it upward in solution. Then, as that water rises and cools near the surface, the silica falls back out and hardens, building the pale, crusty deposits that give these basins their otherworldly look. The same mineral that paints the beautiful terraces is the mineral that seals the conduits and sets the trap. The beauty and the danger are made of the exact same thing. Every gorgeous pale rim you admire in a photograph is, in a sense, evidence of the process that builds the pressure cookers in the first place. Part 7. The pool that was not there. Here is the part of the story that genuinely has not been documented quite like this before, and it is the reason this smaller explosion may matter more than the larger one. Days after the explosion, the scientists found a new pool. A pool of boiling water that simply had not existed before. It was not there on the morning of June 13th. It was not there in the immediate aftermath. And then it was, sitting near the middle group of vents, a feature of the landscape that the Earth had manufactured out of nothing in the span of a few days. New hot springs do not just appear in your week, but this one did, and how it formed is the detail that should make the hair on your arm stand up. Let me give you the timeline precisely, because the timing is the whole point. The explosion happened on the morning of June 13th. The new pool, though, formed later. The scientists were able to pin it down to a window between the afternoon of June 14th and the morning of June 16th. So somewhere in the 2 to 3 days after the initial blast, in ground that had already been disturbed, a new boiling pool came into existence. The explosion was not the end of the event. It was the beginning of a process that kept working, kept changing the landscape, for days afterward while everyone watched. And when the geologists examined how this new pool had formed, they found something that does not match the usual story of a hot spring being born. Normally, if an explosion creates a new opening, you expect to see ejecta around it. The thrown-out material, the rocks and debris blasted outward to form a rim, that is the signature of something being punched out from below. But around this new pool, that signature was missing. There was no surrounding apron of blasted material to explain it, and so the United States Geological Survey reached a different and far more unsettling conclusion about how it had formed. They said it formed by collapse, not by an explosion punching a hole upward and outward, by the ground giving way and falling inward. The surface had caved in, dropped down into the disturbed, hollowed-out space below, and filled with boiling water. The pool was not blasted open. It was a sinkhole into the Earth's plumbing. I need you to really feel the difference between those two things, because it is everything. An explosion is a single, violent moment. It happens, it is terrifying, and then it is over, and you can at least tell yourself the danger has passed. Collapse is something else. Collapse means the ground was undermined, hollowed out from beneath, and then surrendered to gravity in the days that followed, quietly, without a second explosion to announce it. It means that even after the blast was over, Even after the river had run grey and the vents had opened, the ground itself was still failing, still dropping, still rearranging itself into new and dangerous shapes while the explosion was already old news. The threat on June 13th was the blast. The threat on June 14th, 15th and 16th was the ground itself, continuing to give way under its own weight. Now picture the dimensions, because they make it real. This new pool measured about 6.5 meters by 5 1/3 meters. In feet, that is roughly 21 feet by 17 feet. That is not a puddle. That is bigger than a lot of bedrooms, an opening in the earth large enough to swallow a small room's worth of space, filled with vigorously boiling, grey, silty water, sitting where solid ground had been just days earlier. And remember the through line from the very first minutes of this story. The scientists had walked this ground. People study this basin, and a patch of that studied, walked-upon ground had now collapsed into a boiling pit wide enough to take a car. Had the timing been different, had this been an open boardwalk on a summer afternoon instead of a closed basin in the pre-dawn dark, the question of what or who was standing on that ground when it dropped becomes a question I do not want to finish asking. This is why I keep hammering the same point, and I will keep hammering it, because it is the lesson that could actually save a life. Smaller does not mean safer. The 2024 explosion was bigger, louder, more spectacular, and it ended. This one was smaller, and it did the more insidious thing. It kept going. It opened the ground, and then it kept opening the ground, collapsing in slow motion over days into a boiling new feature that the landscape had never contained before. And as unsettling as a new collapse pool is, the ground was still not done performing, because a few days after the pool appeared, it started doing something that turned a quiet sinkhole into something that looked, frighteningly, like the birth of a brand new geyser. To understand why collapse is the more sinister outcome, picture the difference between two ways a ceiling can fail. One way is a single beam snapping, a loud, instantaneous break over in a moment. The other way is the slow rot of the supports above, the kind where the ceiling sags, holds, sags further, and then comes down days later when you have stopped watching it. The explosion was the snap. The collapse pool was the slow rot. The blast hollowed out and weakened the ground, undermining it from below, and then over the following days that undermined ground simply could not hold its own weight, and it dropped, quietly, into the cavity beneath. No second explosion announced it. The ground just went. And that delayed, multi-day evolution is genuinely unusual to capture, which is part of why this event is being studied so closely. Most hydrothermal explosions are treated as single moments, a bang and an aftermath. But June 13th refused to behave like a single moment. It kept developing, kept reshaping the ground for days, with each new day adding a feature that had not been there before. That is not just a hazard. It is a process, an ongoing rearrangement of the shallow earth, and the fact that it was documented step by step, collapse and all, is exactly the kind of observation that has been nearly impossible to make until now. The ground did something rare, and for once the cameras were rolling the entire time, and there is a detail in the timing of the collapse that I find quietly chilling the more I think about it. The ground did not give way during the explosion, in the chaos of that first violent morning when you might expect the damage to happen. It gave way afterward, in the calm. Between the afternoon of June 14th and the morning of June 16th, on days when, to a casual observer, the worst would have seemed over, the ground was still failing. Imagine the false sense of security that creates. The bang has come and gone, the drama has passed, the basin seems to be settling, and that is precisely the window in which a chunk of solid-looking earth quietly dropped into a boiling cavity. It is a reminder that with this hazard, the explosion is not necessarily the end of the danger. Sometimes the explosion is just the part that draws your eye, while the ground keeps doing its real and patient work in the days after everyone has stopped watching. Part 8. When the new pool came alive. A collapse pool full of boiling water is unsettling enough, but on June 18th, the new pool stopped being a quiet pit and started to perform. The cameras recorded it. In several separate episodes, each lasting a few minutes, the new pool began to spout, throwing boiling water up into the air, and not by a trivial amount. The water shot up somewhere between 6 and 9 meters high. In feet, that is roughly 20 to 30 feet, a column of boiling water erupting upward from a feature that, 1 week earlier, had not existed at all. The ground had gone from solid to torn to collapse to actively spouting in a matter of days. It was not settling down, it was waking up. Let me walk you through the full sequence again, laid end to end, because when you see it as one continuous story, the pattern is genuinely startling. First, a hidden pressure event underground, caught by the instruments at 9 minutes past 5 in the morning. Then, the dark plume bursting from bare ground. Then, 3 new vents and a boiling fracture 61 feet long. Then, the river running grey for almost 4 miles. Then, over the following 2 to 3 days, the ground collapsing inward to form a new boiling pool where there had been solid earth. And then, days after that same new pool roaring to life and throwing boiling water 30 feet into the sky. Every stage of that sequence happened after the one before it, each a fresh development, each adding something the basin had not shown a week earlier. This was not an event. This was an unfolding. And that word unfolding is exactly what makes it so different from what came before. A normal geyser eruption is a release. The pressure builds, it lets go, it resets, and it does it again on something resembling a schedule. What happened here was not a release on a schedule. This was the shallow plumbing of Biscuit Basin physically reorganizing itself in real time, opening new vents, hollowing out the ground, collapsing the surface, and then forcing boiling water up through the wreckage in a brand new spot. The landscape was being rewritten, day by day, in front of the cameras, and nobody pressed a button to make it stop because nobody can. There is no valve. There is only the ground, doing what the pressure and the heat and the failing rock dictate. Now I want to come back to the cameras for a moment, because they are quietly the heroes of this whole story, and they are the reason we can even tell it. Without that camera installed in May of 2025, and without the monitoring station planted that summer, almost none of this would be known in this kind of detail. The spouting on June 18th would have been a thing that happened in an empty, closed basin with nobody to see it. Instead, we have a recorded, time-stamped sequence of a new hydrothermal feature being born and then coming alive, captured from close range. This is the documentation of a process that, historically, scientists have only ever been able to infer from the wreckage left behind. For once, the wreckage was filmed as it was being made. So step back and ask the obvious question, the one I have been circling this whole time. How unstable is the ground around Black Diamond Pool right now? Look at the record of just the last 2 years. A massive explosion in 2024, repeated eruptions from the pool through 2025, and now, in June of 2026, an explosion from new ground, 3 new vents, a 61-foot fracture, a collapse-formed pool, and that pool spouting boiling water within days. That is not the record of a system that blew off some steam and went back to sleep. That is the record of a patch of the Earth that has been actively, restlessly failing for 2 straight years, and that is still, as of right now, rearranging itself. The honest answer to how unstable it is this. Nobody can promise you it is finished. And that uncertainty is exactly the thing that should reframe how you think about the danger here, because the danger most people imagine when they hear the word Yellowstone is not this one at all. It is something far larger, far more famous, and, as the data is about to show us, far less likely to be your actual problem. It is worth remembering that at Yellowstone, thermal features are not permanent fixtures. They are born, they change, they migrate, and they die, sometimes over decades, sometimes over days. Hot springs go quiet, geysers fall dormant, and then, years later, surprise everyone by erupting again. The whole landscape is in slow, constant motion, a living plumbing system that rearranges itself on timescales both human and geologic. So the birth of a new spouting pool is not, by itself, a sign of doom. It is, in a sense, Yellowstone doing what Yellowstone does. What makes this birth remarkable is not that it happened, but that we watched it happen, from the first tear in the ground to the first column of boiling water, all on camera, all at close range. That is why I keep calling the cameras the quiet heroes of this story. Without them, the spouting on June 18th would have been an unwitnessed event in a locked basin, perhaps inferred later from changes in the ground, but never actually seen in the act of forming. Instead, we have a recorded biography of a thermal feature, from violent birth to active life, captured over a span of days. Scientists almost never get that. They get the before from old maps, and the after from later surveys, but rarely the becoming. June 13th through 18th handed them the becoming frame by frame, and that record will be studied long after the new pool itself has changed into something else, or vanished entirely, the way these features always eventually do. And think about what the spouting on June 18th implies about the energy still in the system. A feature that has merely collapsed is, in a sense, passive, just ground that fell into a hole and filled with hot water. But a feature that spouts is active. It is being driven, pushed, powered by pressure and heat, still flowing up from below, strong enough to hurl boiling water 20 to 30 feet into the air in repeated episodes. So the new pool was not a scar left behind by a finished event. It was a living vent, freshly connected to the energy of the shallow system and putting that energy on display. The ground did not just fail on June 13th and then lie still. Days later, it was actively erupting from a brand new throat, which tells you the forces that opened it were not spent. They had simply found a new place to come out. Part 9. The question that changes everything. Everything about why this event matters comes down to a single question, and it is a question scientists are now chasing through the data minute by minute. Was there a warning? Somewhere in those close-range recordings, in the seismic trace, in the infrasound, in the temperature readings, in the camera frames from the minutes before 50 seconds past 5:09 in the morning, is there a sign, a precursor, some subtle, repeatable signal that, if you learn to recognize it, would let you say, the ground is about to fail, get off the boardwalk right now? Because the answer to that question does not just matter for one pool in one basin. It matters for every steaming acre of ground that human beings walk across in that park, and it splits the future into two very different paths. Let me explain why scientists do not already know the answer, because it tells you how genuinely hard this problem is. Predicting a hydrothermal explosion is one of the most difficult forecasting challenges in all of geology. Earthquakes at least announce themselves through faults we can map and strain we can measure. Volcanic eruptions of magma usually give weeks or months of swelling ground and rising tremor. But a hydrothermal explosion is small, shallow, fast, and hidden, and the entire dangerous process, the silica sealing the channel, the pressure climbing, the rock straining toward failure, happens out of sight beneath ground that looks completely ordinary. There is often nothing on the surface to see, and historically there has been nothing close enough to measure either. Consider what happened, or rather what did not happen, in 2024. When Black Diamond Pool exploded that July morning and nearly caught a crowd, scientists went looking for the warning signs afterward, and the uncomfortable truth is that there was no hydrothermal monitoring station at Biscuit Basin at the time, and the broader network barely even registered the blast. Think about that. An explosion violent enough to destroy a boardwalk and throw debris across a square kilometre, and the monitoring network almost did not notice it at all. So when people ask, why did nobody warn the tourists in 2024, the honest and sobering answer is that there may have been no warning to give, and there was certainly nothing positioned close enough to catch one if it existed. That is precisely the gap the new instruments were installed to close, and June 13th is the test case they were built for. For the first time, scientists have seismic, infrasound, thermal and camera data from roughly 100 meters away, capturing the lead-up to an explosion in detail. So now they are doing the painstaking work of going back through every trace, second by second, asking the same question over and over. Is there a tell in here? Did the temperature drift in some particular way? Did the infrasound carry a particular note? Did the ground hum with a particular pattern of microtremors in the minutes before it tore? They are essentially trying to read the Earth's body language in the moments before it threw its punch, using the closest footage anyone has ever captured. And here is where the two futures split, because both possible answers are profound. Suppose they find a precursor. Suppose buried in that data is a clear, repeatable signal that reliably precedes an explosion. If that is true, it would be a breakthrough, the first real foothold on forecasting an event class that has been essentially unforecastable. It would mean that, with the right sensors in the right basins, scientists might one day be able to issue warnings to clear a boardwalk minutes before the ground lets go. That is the hopeful path, and it is genuinely possible, and it is the reason this dataset is being treated as a kind of scientific treasure. But now suppose the opposite. Suppose they comb through every trace and find nothing. Suppose the seismic line is flat, the infrasound is silent, the temperature is steady, right up until the half second the rock breaks and the ground explodes. If that is what the data shows, then we are looking at the more frightening truth, the one this channel has warned about before. It would confirm that this hazard can give no usable warning at all, that the ground can sit there, quiet and steaming and apparently safe, with families walking across it, and then fail without a whisper of warning anyone could act on. It would mean that the only real protection is distance, closing the ground entirely, because you simply cannot trust it to tell you before it goes. I want to be honest with you about something, because it is the part that keeps me up. We do not yet know which of those two answers is the right one. The analysis is ongoing as we speak, but notice that both answers lead to the same uncomfortable place in the meantime. Either these explosions can be forecast, and we are only now, in 2026, taking the very first steps toward learning how, which means we cannot do it reliably yet, or they cannot be forecast at all, in which case the quiet ground is exactly as dangerous as it looks reassuring. In both cases, today, right now, the correct assumption for anyone standing in a thermal basin is that the ground owes you no warning, and that brings us to the fear that the word Yellowstone always summons, the one that fills the comments every time this place so much as steams a little harder than usual. The fear of the supervolcano. Because here is the strange twist. The thing most people are terrified of is not the thing that should worry them, and the data could not be clearer about why. Let me make the forecasting problem concrete with a comparison, because it shows just how far behind we are with this particular hazard. With a hurricane, we get days, we watch it form, we track it across the ocean, we model its path, and we tell people to leave. With a magmatic eruption, the kind that involves rising lava, we usually get weeks or months of swelling ground and rising tremor, time enough to evacuate whole towns. Even with earthquakes, where prediction remains famously hard, we at least understand the faults, we map the strain, we know roughly where the danger lives. A hydrothermal explosion offers none of that. It can be smaller than a house, shallower than a backyard pool, and it can go from sealed and silent to detonating in moments, with the entire dangerous process hidden underground. It is, in a real sense, the hardest kind of geological violence to see coming, and the stakes of cracking this problem reach far beyond one basin in Wyoming. Hydrothermal explosions are not unique to Yellowstone. They happen in geyser fields and volcanic terrains all over the world, in Iceland, in New Zealand, in any place where hot water meets shallow rock, and the conditions are right to seal and pressurize a chamber. So if scientists can learn to read the precursors here, in the best instrumented case ever recorded, those lessons could travel. They could inform monitoring at thermal areas across the planet, places where tourists walk the same kind of beautiful, deceptive ground. June 13th is a Yellowstone story, but the knowledge it might unlock is a global one. There is also a humbling honesty in how the scientists are talking about this, and I want to credit it, because it is rare. They are not claiming to have it figured out. They are saying, in effect, we finally have the data, and now we have to find out what it contains, and we genuinely do not yet know. That kind of openness, admitting the limits of what we know while actively working to push those limits back, is science at its most trustworthy. It is the opposite of the cover-up the conspiracy crowd imagines. It is people standing in front of the unknown and saying plainly, here is what we caught, here is what we hope it tells us, and here is what we cannot yet promise. And what they cannot yet promise is the one thing everyone most wants, which is a warning. And notice what this means for the very idea of safety in a place like this, because it is a hard truth to sit with. We are comfortable, as a species, with dangers that announce themselves. We can respect a storm we can see coming, a fault we can map, a fire we can watch advance. What we struggle with is a danger that hides perfectly until the instant it acts, because there is nothing to react to until it is already happening. A hydrothermal explosion is that second kind of danger in its purest form, and until June 13th we did not even have the data to know whether it had to be that way, or whether it merely seemed that way because we had never watched closely enough. That is the quiet revolution of this event. It does not just record an explosion. It finally lets us ask with real evidence whether the silence before the blast is truly empty, or whether it has been whispering all along in a language we never had the instruments to hear. Part 10. The Monster. Everyone fears, and the one they should. Say the word Yellowstone to almost anyone, and a single image detonates in their mind. The supervolcano, the continent-ending eruption, the ash cloud that buries half of North America and plunges the world into a volcanic winter. It is the stuff of documentaries and disaster films, and every single time anything unusual happens in that park, A wave of voices online declares that this is it, the big one is coming, the caldera is waking up, and they are hiding it from you. So let us deal with that fear directly and honestly, because the data on this event is unusually clear, and the truth is more useful, and in its own way more unsettling, than the Hollywood version. Let me give you the actual numbers on Yellowstone's volcanic status, the ones measured during this very period. The volcano alert level remains at normal, the aviation colour code remains green. Those are the lowest, calmest settings on the scale, the all clear. In the month of May, the entire Yellowstone region recorded just 45 located earthquakes, and the largest of them was a magnitude 2.0. A magnitude 2 is a tremor you would likely not even feel standing on top of it. There were no earthquake swarms, the clustered bursts of seismicity that can signal magma on the move, and the ground deformation, the slow swelling or sinking that scientists watch obsessively as a sign of magma shifting underground, showed no major volcanic signal. Every one of the big picture indicators that would scream magmatic unrest is sitting quiet and normal. So let me say it plainly, because you deserve a straight answer. The June 13th event is not a sign that the Yellowstone supervolcano is about to erupt. It is not magma rising. It is not the caldera stirring. A hydrothermal explosion, as we covered, is a shallow steam event, driven by trapped water and sealing minerals in the uppermost plumbing, completely separate from the underlying magmatic system. You can have hydrothermal explosions all day long without the magma chamber doing anything at all. They are, geologically speaking, a surface phenomenon. So if your fear walking away from this is that the big one is imminent, set that fear down. The instruments that would detect a true magmatic ramp-up are watching around the clock, and right now they say normal, green, quiet. But here is the twist, and it is the whole point of this video, so I want you to really hear it. The fact that it is not the supervolcano does not mean it is not dangerous. It means the danger is real, but misnamed. People stare at the horizon waiting for a mushroom cloud that is not coming anytime soon, and in doing so they walk right past the hazard that is actually under their feet. The real, present, documented danger at Yellowstone is not lava. It is boiling water trapped beneath sealed ground that can fail without warning, exactly like it did on June 13th, exactly like it did in 2024 when it nearly caught a crowd. The monster everyone fears lives in the distant future and the realm of statistics. The monster that should concern you lives a few feet under the boardwalk and operates on the timescale of a single summer morning. We have talked about this reframing before on this channel, the idea that the true Yellowstone threat is not the one in the movies, and June 13th is the ground itself underlining that point in boiling water. Because think about which of these two dangers you could actually encounter. The odds of being present for a caldera-forming super eruption in your lifetime are so vanishingly small they are barely worth the worry. But the odds of standing in a thermal basin where the ground could open without warning? That is not hypothetical. That is a thing that has happened twice now in 2 years at one single basin, and that draws millions of people every season. The danger people dismiss as too small to think about is the one that is statistically real, and the danger they obsess over is the one that is, for all practical purposes, not their problem. I find this is one of those cases where the truth is genuinely scarier than the conspiracy, and far more useful. The conspiracy says the government is hiding an imminent super eruption, but the data is published openly, precisely because scientists want eyes on it, and the all-clear indicators are right there for anyone to read. There is no hidden mushroom cloud. What there is instead is an honest and frightening admission, made out in the open. Scientists are telling you that this shallow hazard is real, that it can strike with little or no warning, and that they are only now, with this June 13th dataset, beginning to learn whether it can be predicted at all. That is not a cover-up. That is something more unsettling than a cover-up. It is the people who know the most, telling you plainly that the ground can fail without notice, and that they cannot yet promise to warn you. So we can put the supervolcano fear to rest, at least for the timescales that matter to you and me, and replace it with a sharper and more accurate one. The threat is the crust, not the caldera. The threat is the steam, not the magma. The threat operates in seconds, not centuries. And once you accept that, a natural question follows, the one that decides whether you should actually be worried day to day. How rare is an event like June 13th, really? Is this a freak, once-in-a-lifetime convulsion, or is it something that happens more often than the headlines would suggest? The answer is going to surprise you, and it is the key to understanding exactly what is and is not unprecedented about what just happened. To put the supervolcano fear in its proper scale, consider the timescales involved. The truly enormous caldera-forming eruptions that built Yellowstone's reputation are separated by hundreds of thousands of years, and the most recent one was on the order of hundreds of thousands of years ago. We're talking about a clock that ticks in increments longer than the entire span of human civilization, longer than our species has looked anything like it does now. To worry, on a given summer afternoon, that the caldera is about to erupt is a little like standing on a beach and refusing to go in the water because someday the continents will rearrange themselves. It is true on a long enough timeline. It is simply not the thing that is going to affect your trip. Meanwhile, the hazard that genuinely could affect your trip operates on a clock measured in a single morning. The contrast could not be sharper, and yet our instincts get it exactly backwards. We are drawn to the spectacular civilization-ending fantasy precisely because it is spectacular, and we wave away the modest-sounding hydrothermal explosion precisely because it sounds modest. But modest is the wrong word for a column of boiling water and rock 400 to 600 feet tall erupting from the ground where you're standing in under a minute. Our fear has been hijacked by the wrong monster, and the cost of that misdirection is that people underestimate the real and present danger of the ground they actually walk on. This is why I think the honest framing is so much more valuable than the apocalyptic one. The apocalyptic framing leaves you afraid of something you cannot affect and will almost certainly never witness. The honest framing leaves you with something useful, an accurate respect for active thermal ground, an understanding of why the basin is closed, and a clear sense of where the actual risk lives. Fear is only worth carrying if it protects you. Fear of the supervolcano protects no one. A sober respect for the quiet, sealed crust over boiling water is the kind of fear that might actually keep a person off the wrong patch of ground on the wrong morning. And I want to address the instinct directly, the one that says, but they would hide it from us, wouldn't they, if the big one were really coming? Set aside for a moment how difficult it would actually be to hide swelling ground and earthquake swarms from the thousands of independent scientists and amateur watchers who monitor this place. Look instead at what is actually being published. The alert level, the earthquake counts, the deformation data, the camera footage, the analysis of the June 13th event, all of it is being put out in the open, in detail, for anyone to examine. That is not the behavior of an institution sitting on a secret apocalypse. It is the behavior of scientists who want as many eyes as possible on a hazard they are still working to understand. The transparency itself is the answer to the conspiracy. The frightening part is not what they are hiding. The frightening part is what they are telling you plainly, which is that this shallow ground can fail without warning, and they cannot yet promise to see it coming. Part 11. How rare is it, really? So is what happened on June 13th genuinely rare, or does this kind of thing happen more often than the dramatic headlines let on? This is the question where I have to be completely straight with you, because the honest answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no, and it is the key to understanding exactly what is and is not unprecedented here. The truth is that hydrothermal explosions at Yellowstone come in a whole range of sizes, and how often they happen depends enormously on how big they are. The little ones are almost routine. The giant ones are the stuff of geologic time, and June 13th sits at a very particular and revealing point on that scale. Let me lay out the frequencies, because scientists at the United States Geological Survey have actually worked them out, and the numbers reset your sense of scale. Small hydrothermal explosions, events on the order of what happened on June 13th, probably occur somewhere in Yellowstone about once a year. Once a year. They are, in the grand scheme of the park, a regular feature of how this restless landscape behaves. Step up in size to something like the explosion at Pork Chop Geyser in 1989, and you are looking at events that happen roughly every several years. The remains of that 1989 pork chop explosion, an apron of shattered rock about 15 feet across, are still visible today, a permanent scar from a single violent afternoon. Now keep climbing the scale, and the timescales stretch out toward the edge of comprehension. Explosions large enough to blast out a crater the size of an acre probably happen only about once every several hundred years, and the truly monstrous events, the ones that carve craters larger than 10 acres, occur on the order of once every several thousand years. At the very top of that scale sits a place that should be far more famous than it is. It is called Mary Bay, on the northern edge of Yellowstone Lake, and it is the largest hydrothermal explosion crater documented anywhere in the world. Mary Bay is about 1.5 miles across. A crater 1.5 miles wide, blasted out by steam, formed roughly 13,800 years ago, possibly in several explosions over a short span of time. That is the ceiling of what this phenomenon is capable of, and it dwarfs anything in human memory. So where does June 13th land on that scale? Near the bottom. It was, by the measure of the thrown rock and the size of the features, a small event, the kind that probably happens about once a year somewhere in the park. And this is exactly why I have been so careful about the framing from the very start. If you wanted to claim that a hydrothermal explosion itself is something no one has ever seen, that would simply not be true. They happen yearly. People have seen plenty of them. The phenomenon is not the rare part. So what is? What actually justifies calling this one historic, one for the record books? Because there genuinely is something here that has never been seen before, and it is crucial to put your finger on exactly what it is. Two things make June 13th unprecedented, and neither of them is the explosion. The first, which we have already covered, is the proximity to instruments. No hydrothermal explosion has ever occurred this close to a monitoring station, roughly 100 meters away, which means the close-range recording of how it began is genuinely without precedent. We have never had data this good. That is new. The second is what the ground did afterward. A new pool, formed not by an explosion blasting outward, but by the surface collapsing inward, in the days following the event, and then beginning to spout boiling water. Documenting that whole evolving sequence, the collapse and the birth of a new spouting feature, captured on camera step by step, is the kind of observation that has historically been almost impossible to make. That is the never-before-seen part, not the bang, the recording, and the slow, eerie aftermath. This distinction is not me splitting hairs, and I want to explain why it actually matters to you. It matters because precision is the difference between informing you and frightening you with a falsehood. If I told you that hydrothermal explosions are vanishingly rare and that one just happened, you might conclude that the park is doing something wildly abnormal and that catastrophe is near. That would be wrong. The small explosions are normal. The park does this. What is abnormal is that, for once, we were watching closely enough to learn from it, and that the ground performed a rare and instructive trick by collapsing into a new pool while the cameras rolled. The correct emotional response is not panic that something unprecedented and apocalyptic is unfolding. It is a sober respect for a hazard that is more common than people realize, finally being studied better than ever before, and yet do not let common be mistaken for harmless, because that is the other trap. A thing can happen once a year and still kill you if you're standing on it. The fact that small hydrothermal explosions are a regular feature of Yellowstone is not reassuring when you remember that one of them, in 2024, nearly caught a crowd, and that this one collapsed a chunk of ground into a boiling pit wide enough to swallow a car. Routine, at Yellowstone, does not mean safe. It means the danger is always present, always cycling, always somewhere in the park doing its quiet work beneath ground that looks perfectly solid. So if these events happen yearly, and if the ground at Biscuit Basin specifically has been failing over and over for 2 straight years, the real question becomes about that one basin. Just how unsettled is the ground around Black Diamond Pool right now, after everything it has done since 2024? Because the pattern, when you lay it all out, does not look like a system that is calming down. Let me linger on Mary Bay for a moment, because it is the kind of place that recalibrates your sense of what this phenomenon can do. A crater, 1.5 miles across, blasted out of the earth by nothing more than steam and pressure, around 13,800 years ago. There were human beings alive on this continent then. Nobody recorded it, but somewhere, people may have felt the ground convulse and seen the sky fill. That single crater, the largest of its kind documented anywhere on Earth, sits quietly today on the edge of Yellowstone Lake, so large and so old that most visitors never realize they are looking at the scar of an explosion at all. It is the ceiling of this hazard, the reminder that the same basic mechanism that opened a 61-foot crack on June 13th can, given enough scale and time, carve a wound you could lose a town inside. But scale is exactly the point, and it cuts in a reassuring direction for the present day. Those mile-wide events are creatures of geologic time, separated by thousands of years. The June 13th event was at the opposite, common end of the spectrum, the yearly kind, the small kind. So when we hold the two together, we get the accurate picture. The phenomenon ranges from the routine to the cataclysmic, and what just happened was firmly at the routine end of that range, distinguished not by its violence but by how closely it was watched, and how strangely it evolved afterward. I keep insisting on this precision because precision is what separates honest fascination from cheap fear, and this channel has always tried to stay on the honest side of that line. It would be easy, and frankly it would get more clicks in the short term, to tell you that something unprecedented and terrifying just happened at Yellowstone and leave the impression that catastrophe looms. But the truth is better, and stranger, and more worth your time. A common kind of event happened in an uncommon place, beside a notorious pool, close enough to instruments that we learned more from it than from any explosion before, and then it did something rare and instructive by collapsing into a new pool on camera. That is the real story. It does not need to be inflated. It is remarkable exactly as it is. It also reframes what the closure of the basin really represents when you hold it against these frequencies. If small explosions happen somewhere in the park about once a year, and if this one specific basin has produced repeated events for 2 years running, then keeping it closed is not an overreaction to a freak occurrence. It is a measured response to a place that has earned its reputation through repetition. The authorities are not reacting to a single scary morning. They are responding to a pattern, to a stretch of ground that keeps proving, on its own schedule, that it cannot be trusted with people standing on it. Seen through the lens of how often these things actually happen, the closure looks less like caution and more like simple arithmetic. Part 12. 2 years of a system that will not settle. If you want to understand how worried to be about the ground around Black Diamond Pool, you cannot look at June 13th in isolation. You have to step back and look at the whole arc, the full 2-year record, and when you do, a pattern emerges that is genuinely hard to dismiss. Because this is not the story of a hot spring that did something dramatic once and then went back to its quiet life. This is the story of a patch of ground that erupted, and then kept erupting, and reshaped itself again and again, over and over, for the better part of 2 years, and that as of right now still has not found its way back to anything resembling calm. Let me retrace that arc, because laid end to end it tells its own story. It begins in July of 2024, with the big one, the explosion that hurled debris 400 to 600 feet into the air, destroyed the boardwalk and sent a crowd running. That was the opening blast, the event that closed the basin. But then, instead of going quiet the way a system that has released its pressure should, Black Diamond Pool kept going. There was an eruption in May of 2025. There was a muddy eruption captured in December of 2025. Smaller events came and went through the months in between. Again and again, a pool that simply refused to stand down. And most of these were barely witnessed by human eyes, not because they were not happening, but because the basin was closed, so there were no crowds and few observers to see a feature throwing its tantrums into an empty, locked-off landscape. Now think about what that pattern actually signifies, because the distinction is everything. A pressure cooker that vents once and falls silent is reassuring. You can tell yourself the trapped energy is gone, the seal has broken, the danger has passed. But a system that explodes, and then keeps erupting in fits and starts for nearly 2 years, is telling you something fundamentally different. It is telling you that the underground plumbing has been knocked into a new and unstable configuration, and that it is still actively searching for a stable one it has not yet found. The 2024 explosion did not relieve the system and end the story. It seems to have kicked the whole shallow network into a restless, ongoing state of reorganization, where new channels open, old ones seal, pressure migrates, and the ground keeps adjusting itself in ways nobody can fully predict. And June 13th fits that pattern exactly, and arguably escalates it. Because this time the system did not just erupt again from the familiar pool, it tore open 3 new vents in fresh ground to the north. It opened a 61-foot fracture, and then, in the days that followed, it collapsed the surface into a brand new boiling pool that then began to spout. That is not the behavior of a system winding down. That is a system expanding its footprint, finding new weak points, claiming new ground. The dangerous zone at Biscuit Basin did not shrink after June 13th. It grew. The plumbing reached out and rewrote a new patch of the map in its own violent handwriting, and there is no particular reason to assume it has finished. We have explored this idea before on this channel, the notion that the part of Yellowstone you should actually keep your eyes on is not the sleeping giant of the magma chamber, but the twitchy, active, shallow hydrothermal system that is doing real and visible things on human timescales. June 13th is that idea made concrete. It is the shallow system demonstrating in real time and on camera that it is the live wire here, not in some distant future. Now, this year, this month. The ground around Black Diamond Pool has been one of the most geologically active and unstable patches of accessible North America for 2 years running, and the June event is the latest proof that the trend line is not pointing toward calm. So how unstable is that ground right now? I will give you the most honest answer I can, which is the answer the scientists themselves are careful to give. Nobody can promise you it is done. The magmatic system, the supervolcano, remains quiet and normal, and that is genuinely reassuring on the larger scale. But the shallow hydrothermal system at Biscuit Basin is demonstrably, measurably, repeatedly unstable, and it has been for 2 years, and the June 13th event shows it is still capable of opening new ground and collapsing it without warning. The honest verdict is not panic, and it is not all clear. It is something in between, something that demands respect. This is a piece of the earth that is actively changing, that has tried to hurt people once, and that cannot be trusted to behave. And that verdict has a very direct, very human implication, because for years people walked right across that ground. Which raises the question I genuinely want you to answer for yourself. Knowing everything you now know, would you have walked there? Picture the basin during those closed months, because the image tells you something the data alone cannot. A beautiful, otherworldly stretch of thermal ground, fenced off, empty of people, and in the middle of that emptiness, a pool that simply will not be still, erupting in May, oozing a muddy eruption in December, throwing fits into a landscape with no audience. There is something almost eerie about it, a violent feature performing again and again in an empty theatre, witnessed only by the instruments and the occasional camera. It is the picture of a system that is not responding to anything on the surface, not to crowds, not to seasons, but purely to its own internal pressures, working themselves out on its own restless schedule. That internal clock quality is exactly what makes the destabilization so hard to dismiss as a fluke. A one-time explosion could be explained away as a single chamber that happened to seal and fail. But a 2-year run of repeated eruptions, culminating in new vents and a collapse pool in fresh ground, describes a whole shallow network that has been knocked into disequilibrium and is still hunting for a new balance. Every eruption relieves one pocket of pressure and, in doing so, can redirect water and heat into another, sealing here, opening there, migrating the danger around the basin. It is less like a single bomb and more like a system of connected chambers passing the pressure between them, never quite settling. And this is the through line that ties June 13th to everything that came before it, and to the warnings this channel has raised about where the real Yellowstone danger lives. The shallow system is the active one, not in geologic abstraction, but in the immediate this year, this month sense. While the public stares at the magma chamber and waits for an eruption that is hundreds of thousands of years between acts, the hydrothermal system right beneath the surface has spent 2 solid years demonstrating that it is awake, unsettled, and fully capable of opening the ground without notice. June 13th did not start that story. It is the latest, and possibly not the last chapter of it. It is also worth saying that none of this means the basin is doomed to keep escalating forever, and I do not want to leave you with a false sense of inevitability. Shallow hydrothermal systems do eventually find new equilibria. The pressure works itself out, the channels stabilize, the ground quiets, sometimes for years or decades, until the slow process of sealing begins again somewhere else. So it is entirely possible that Biscuit Basin will calm down, that the new pool will fade, that the vents will crust over and go still. The honest point is not that catastrophe is guaranteed. The honest point is that we cannot currently tell the difference between a system that is settling and a system that is reloading, because the dangerous part happens underground and out of sight. 2 years of repeated activity simply means the smart assumption, for now, is to treat that ground as unsettled until it proves otherwise over a much longer stretch of quiet than it has shown us so far. Part 13. Would you walk there? I want to make this personal for a moment, because all the data in the world means nothing until you stand it up next to a human being on a boardwalk. So picture yourself there, on a bright summer morning before any of this happened, walking the wooden boardwalk through Biscuit Basin. The steam is rising in gentle curtains around you. The pools glow in impossible blues and greens. It is one of the most beautiful, otherworldly places on the entire planet, and that beauty is exactly the point, because it is the beauty that puts you there, standing a few feet from features that the Earth can turn into weapons in under a minute, and the ground beneath your shoes looks, for all the world, completely solid. Now lay the facts over that peaceful image. The ground you're standing on is a thin crust over a shallow plumbing system full of water heated to near boiling. Somewhere beneath you, silica may be quietly sealing a channel shut. Pressure may be climbing toward the breaking point of the rock, and there may be no sign of it on the surface at all. In July of 2024, on a morning exactly like the one you're imagining, with people standing right where you are standing, that crust failed, and a column of boiling water and rock 400 to 600 feet tall erupted out of the ground in less than a minute. The only reason that day is remembered as a near miss and not a massacre is the pure, blind luck of where each rock happened to fall. Yellowstone kept its record on a coin flip, and then consider the June 13th event and what it added to the picture, because it makes the boardwalk thought experiment even more unnerving. The explosion that morning did not come from one of the famous watched pools. It came from a patch of bare, ordinary ground beside them, ground with no track record, ground you would have walked across without a second thought. And in the days that followed, a different patch of ground, also ordinary looking, collapsed inward and filled with boiling water, opening a pit wide enough to swallow a car where solid earth had been. So the lesson is not simply, stay away from the dangerous pools. The lesson is far more disturbing than that. The lesson is that the dangerous ground may not look dangerous at all, and the safe-looking ground beside it may be the very spot that opens next. This is why the park closed Biscuit Basin, and has kept it closed, and I think that decision deserves real respect, because it is the rare case of authorities taking an unglamorous, unpredictable hazard seriously before it forces their hand again. There is no ticket revenue in a closed basin. There is no good publicity in keeping one of your most beautiful attractions locked away. They closed it, and they have kept it closed through every season since, because they looked at what that ground had done and concluded correctly that they could not guarantee the safety of a single person standing on it. When the people with the most data decide the only safe move is to keep everyone away entirely, that tells you something about how seriously you should take the hazard, even when the ground looks perfectly serene. So let me ask you the question directly, the one I keep coming back to, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. If I handed you a ticket to Yellowstone tomorrow, and the basin were open, knowing what you now know, would you walk those boardwalks? Would you stand at the railing a few feet from Black Diamond Pool? I will be honest about where I land. I love these places. I find them as beautiful and as fascinating as anyone alive, and I will tell you plainly that I would not stand on that particular ground, not after 2024, not after June 13th, not while the system is still actively reorganizing itself in ways nobody can predict. The aerial views, the footage, the photographs, that is how I want to experience Biscuit Basin, from a distance, with the ground keeping its secrets to itself. I am not trying to scare you away from Yellowstone, and I want to be clear about that, because the park is enormous, and most of it is exactly as safe as it appears. I am asking you to look at one specific kind of ground with new eyes. The steaming, beautiful, otherworldly ground of an active thermal basin is not a backdrop. It is a living, pressurized system that can fail without warning, and that has now demonstrated twice in 2 years that it will do exactly that. The boardwalks exist because people want to be close to the beauty. The hazard exists because being close to the beauty means standing on the lid of a pressure cooker. And the only thing that decides whether that is a once-in-a-lifetime memory or a tragedy is timing and luck, and whether the ground happens to choose your morning. That is the human stakes, and it is exactly why scientists are now treating the June 13th data as one of the most important records they have ever captured, because hidden inside it may be the thing that finally tips the odds back in our favour. Put a number on the human exposure, and the stakes snap into focus. Yellowstone draws on the order of millions of visitors every single year, and an enormous share of them come precisely to walk the boardwalks through the thermal basins, to stand at the railings, to lean toward the steaming, glowing pools for the photograph. The thermal ground is not some remote, rarely visited corner of the park. It is the main attraction. It is where the crowds concentrate, which means the one kind of ground most prone to sudden, unwarned failure is also, by design, the ground where we gather the most people and bring them the closest. We have built our viewing platforms directly over the pressure cookers, because the pressure cookers are the beautiful part. And the boardwalk itself, that humble wooden walkway, is worth thinking about as a symbol of the whole gamble. It feels safe. It is built, maintained, railed, official. Standing on it, you feel held, the way you feel on any constructed path. But the boardwalk is only as safe as the ground it rests on, and the ground it rests on is exactly the ground we have been describing all along, thin mineral crust over a hot pressurized shifting system. In 2024, that boardwalk was heavily damaged by the very ground it was built to let people safely enjoy. The structure that was supposed to represent safety became, in 55 seconds, a scatter of debris. There is no clearer illustration of the gap between how safe that ground feels and how safe it actually is. So when I ask whether you would walk there, I am not asking an idle question, and I'm not trying to lecture anyone who would say yes. The beauty is real, the odds on any given day are genuinely low, and millions of people walk that ground every year and come home with nothing but extraordinary photographs. I understand the pull completely. I am only asking you to make the choice with clear eyes, knowing that the ground gives no warning, that it has failed twice in 2 years at this one basin, and that the only thing standing between a once-in-a-lifetime memory and a catastrophe is the timing of a morning. Knowing all of that, the choice is yours. I have simply made mine, and mine is to admire it from the air. There is a phrase that fits this situation almost too well. The idea of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, except that here the wrong place looks identical to every right place around it. That is what makes thermal basin danger so different from the dangers we're used to weighing. A cliff edge looks dangerous, so we step back. Open water looks dangerous, so we're careful. But a flat, steaming patch of pale ground beside a beautiful pool looks like the safest thing in the world, looks like exactly the spot you would choose to stand and take the photograph. The hazard wears the costume of safety. And on June 13th, the ground that tore open was precisely that kind of unremarkable, trustworthy-looking ground, which is the whole reason it is worth talking about at all. Part 14, the most important recording they have ever made. Let me bring you back to the instruments one more time, because everything this event might give us, every life it might one day save, depends on what scientists can pull out of that close-range data. Remember the setup. The June 13th explosion happened roughly 100 meters from a monitoring station installed in 2025, the closest any hydrothermal explosion has ever occurred to dedicated instruments. That single fact may make this the most important hydrothermal monitoring event ever captured at Yellowstone, and right now scientists are doing the patient, painstaking work of mining it for everything it is worth. Picture what that work actually looks like, because it is not dramatic, but it may be the most consequential part of the whole story. Researchers now have 4 separate streams of data, all recorded from close range, all time-stamped, all able to be lined up against one another moment by moment. They have the seismic record, every tremor that travelled through the rock. They have the infrasound, every pressure pulse beneath the threshold of hearing. They have the temperature trace from the pool, and they have the camera footage, the visual record of the plume itself bursting from the ground. So now they go back before the moment of the explosion, and they comb through every one of those traces second by second, asking the only question that matters. Is there a signal in here that came before the bang? The reason this is so valuable is that it has never been possible before in this way. We talked about how, in 2024, there was no station close enough, and the network barely caught the explosion at all. So scientists were left studying the aftermath, the wreckage, the scorch mark on the tree. But June 13th flipped that. For once, the lightning was photographed as it struck. If there is a precursor, a creep in temperature, a particular flutter in the infrasound, a pattern of microtremors that builds in the minutes before failure, this is the dataset that could finally reveal it. And if scientists can identify that precursor here, they can start looking for it everywhere, in every wired basin, which is the first real step toward a future where these explosions can be forecast and boardwalks cleared before the ground lets go. And if there is no precursor, then this dataset is just as important, in a darker way, because it would settle the question. It would tell us, with the best evidence ever gathered, that these explosions truly can strike from a state of complete surface calm, that the ground really does owe you no warning, and that the only defense is distance and closure. Either way, the June 13th recording moves us from guessing to knowing. For a hazard that has lived almost entirely in the realm of the unpredictable, Simply knowing which kind of hazard it is, forecastable or not, is an enormous leap forward. That is why scientists are treating this not as a disaster to clean up, but as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to finally understand something that has been killing people occasionally for as long as there have been people near these basins. There is something almost poetic in the timing, and I do not use that word lightly. For years, scientists suspected that Biscuit Basin had more to say, that the ground around Black Diamond Pool was the place most likely to act up again. So they made a deliberate bet. They planted their best instruments in the spot they judged most dangerous, wired up the twitchiest ground in the park, and then they waited, with no guarantee the gamble would ever pay off. They could have waited a decade for nothing. Instead, less than a year later, the ground performed barely a football field away from their sensors and gave them the closest, richest recording of a hydrothermal explosion in history. The bet paid off in a way no scientist would have dared to count on. Sometimes the universe rewards the people who thought to point the camera at the right patch of empty ground. So when the analysis is done and the papers are written, June 13th may be remembered not as the day a small explosion happened at a closed basin, which by itself would be barely a footnote. It may be remembered as the day scientists finally got close enough to start reading the Earth's warning signs at one of its most secretive and dangerous moments. That is the real legacy of this event, and it is why it deserves far more attention than a small explosion in a closed-off basin would normally command. The size of the blast was forgettable. The closeness of the watching was historic, and what they learned from it could change how we protect people in thermal basins all over the world. But underneath all of the science, all of the data, all of the careful analysis, there remains one simple human truth that this whole event keeps circling back to, and it is the thing I want to leave you with. There is a particular kind of patience to the work that comes next, and it is worth honouring because it is where the real payoff lives. Somewhere right now, scientists are sitting with these 4 data streams open side by side, scrolling backward from the moment of the explosion, second by second, hunting for the faintest anomaly. They are asking whether the temperature did something subtle in the final minutes, whether the infrasound carried a particular signature in the lead-up, whether the seismic trace built a pattern of tiny tremors before the rock broke. This is not glamorous work. It is closer to forensic accounting than to disaster footage, but buried in those traces may be the single most valuable thing this hazard has ever offered, which is a warning sign we could learn to recognize, and the reason this particular recording can do what no previous one could comes back to that distance. 100 meters, and to the fact that 4 different kinds of instrument all caught the same event at once. Any one of those data streams alone would be suggestive. Together, cross-checked against each other, time-stamped to the same instance, they are something far more powerful. If a precursor shows up in the seismic data, and also in the infrasound and also in the temperature, all lining up in the minutes before the blast, that is the kind of corroborated signal scientists can actually trust and actually search for elsewhere. The richness of having 4 windows onto the same moment is what makes this dataset worth years of careful study. And whatever they find, the knowledge will not stay locked to this one pool. If a reliable precursor emerges, it becomes a template, something to look for in every wired thermal basin, a way to potentially turn the next June 13th from a near miss into a cleared boardwalk and an evacuated railing. And if no precursor emerges, that too becomes a kind of knowledge, a hard, clarifying fact that tells park managers the only reliable protection is distance and closure, no matter how calm the ground looks. Either outcome is a step out of the dark. For a hazard that has spent all of human history striking essentially without warning, taking even one confident step toward understanding it, is the kind of progress that somewhere down the line saves a life. I want to leave you with the scale of what is genuinely at stake in this analysis, because it is bigger than one basin and one morning. Every year around the world, people walk through thermal areas that operate on exactly the same physics as Biscuit Basin: sealed conduits, pressurized chambers, brittle mineral crust over boiling water, and every so often in one of those places the ground fails and someone is hurt or killed, almost always without warning. So the question scientists are chasing in the June 13th data, is there a precursor, is not an academic curiosity. It is potentially the first thread of a method that could one day protect people in geyser fields on multiple continents. The closest recording ever made of an event we have never been able to predict is being read right now for the first hint of a warning. Whatever it says, we will know more about this hazard than we have ever known, and in a field where the ground has always kept its secrets, knowing more is the only road that has ever led anywhere safer. Part 15. The Quiet Ground. So let us come back to where we started, to the ground itself, and to the simple, unsettling truth that this entire event keeps pointing at. Scientists walked that ground. They studied it, measured it, wired it with instruments, came to know it as well as anyone knows any patch of the Earth. And then, days after the explosion, a piece of that known, studied, walked-upon ground simply gave way and collapsed into a pit of boiling water. The solid Earth that people had stood on became, in the span of a few days, a steaming, spouting wound in the landscape. And the most important question hanging over all of it is whether, this time, for the first time, the instruments caught the moment the ground decided to fail. Think about what that question really means, stripped of all the science. We're asking whether the Earth gives any warning before it betrays the ground beneath your feet, and the honest, frightening answer, as of this moment, is that we do not yet know. The data is still being read, but notice the trap that closes around you no matter which way the answer falls. If there was a warning signal in those traces, then it means that until June 13th, 2026, we did not know how to read it, which means every person who walked those boardwalks before now was trusting ground we could not actually vouch for. And if there was no warning signal at all, then it means the ground can stay perfectly, convincingly quiet right up until the half second it opens, and no amount of watching will ever change that. Either way, the lesson is the same. The quiet ground is not the same thing as the safe ground. And that, in the end, is the real terror of this story. And it is so much more interesting than the supervolcano fantasy that usually fills these conversations. We spend our fear on the wrong monster. We picture the continent-ending eruption, the ash blotting out the sun, the Hollywood apocalypse, and we miss the actual documented present danger sitting a few feet beneath the boardwalk. The supervolcano is, for all the timescales that matter to you and me, a distant statistical ghost. The hydrothermal system is here, now, active, and it has shown us twice in 2 years that it will open the ground without asking permission, in places that looked perfectly solid the day before. The danger was never the thing in the movies. The danger was the ground we trusted. I keep returning to that camera, recording faithfully in the dark at 9 minutes past 5 in the morning, watching a patch of empty ground that, 50 seconds later, would tear open. There is something humbling in that image. We built our instruments, we planted them in the spot we feared most, and we got lucky enough to be watching when the Earth did the thing it almost never lets us see. And what it showed us was not reassuring. It showed us ground that explodes from places with no history, ground that keeps failing for days after the blast, ground that collapses into boiling pools where solid Earth used to be. It showed us, in other words, that the Earth keeps its own counsel, and that our maps of where it is safe to stand are written in pencil, always subject to revision without notice. So here is what I want you to carry out of this. The next time you see a photograph of a steaming Yellowstone basin, beautiful and serene and impossibly coloured, I want you to see it for what it also is. A thin crust over a pressure cooker. A landscape that is alive and moving and in places genuinely unstable, doing its slow and hidden work beneath ground that gives nothing away. Respect it. Marvel at it from a distance. But do not mistake its stillness for safety, because June 13th proved, on camera and at close range, that stillness is exactly the disguise this hazard wears right up until the moment it stops pretending. The supervolcano gets the headlines, but the ground that opened beside Black Diamond Pool, quietly, without warning, and then collapsed into something boiling and new, is the one that should change the way you look at that beautiful, dangerous, restless place. Because the most terrifying thing the Earth can do is not roar. It is to stay perfectly quiet, and then, without a sound you could ever use, simply give way. I think the deepest lesson here is about the gap between appearance and reality, and how dangerous that gap can be when we mistake one for the other. The ground at Biscuit Basin looked solid. It looked like ground. It had the one quality we trust most instinctively in the world, the simple, bedrock assumption that the earth beneath our feet will hold, and then it did not. It tore, it bled sediment into a river, and it collapsed into something boiling. The most fundamental trust a person can have, the trust that the ground is ground, turned out, in that one place, to be a trust the earth had never actually agreed to honour. And that is the thought I cannot quite shake, the one that turns a science story into something closer to a meditation. We spend our lives assuming the solidity of the world beneath us, and almost always that assumption is safe, and we are right to make it. But there are places, beautiful places, where that assumption is quietly false, where the ground is a performance of solidity laid thin over something hot and pressurized and patient. June 13th pulled back the curtain on one of those places, on camera, at close range for the first time, and what it revealed was not a monster roaring. It was something quieter and, to me, far more haunting. It was the ground, calm and steaming and beautiful, keeping its terrible secret right up until the second it chose to let go. So the next time the word Yellowstone summons that mushroom cloud in your mind, I hope you will replace it with a different and truer image. Not a continent buried in ash, but a single patch of pale, steaming ground in the pre-dawn dark, watched by instruments no one was standing near, tearing open at 50 seconds past 5:09 in the morning. That is the real face of the danger. Not the apocalypse in the movies, but the quiet ground that gives no warning. Respect it, marvel at it, and never quite believe its stillness. Because if there is one thing the Earth proved at Biscuit Basin, it is that the most frightening thing it can do is not to roar at you. It is to stay perfectly, beautifully quiet and then simply give way.